Eternal Strands is a game that could easily fall under the radar, and I really hope that I'm wrong. It's the first game from a young studio called Yellow Brick Games. While this is not what most might consider a AAA game, it has more soul than a lot of AAA slop has put out in years. It's not perfect, and I'll get into some of the issues later, but I have been continually impressed with it over the course of 30 plus hours of playtime. With Breath of the Wild style mechanic discovery and Shadow of the Colossus style boss fights, it's a formula that I think has a ton of legs, and I'd love to see them continue to evolve and improve on it. I'll explain why I bring up these games in particular for comparison shortly. Just to be transparent, I was not paid any money for this review, but I was given an advanced copy of the game. It'll be on Game Pass Day 1, January 28th, and you can also find it on the usual marketplaces like Steam, including a demo you can try. Eternal Strands is a single-player action-adventure game, using DNA from several different games to create something that can stand on its own. The melee combat is nothing revolutionary, but the game really shines in its big monster fights and its fun combination of magic abilities you can acquire. If you've played Shadow of the Colossus, you'll know that the bosses in that game are almost more like puzzles, and that's very similar to what we have here. You could also compare it to Dragon's Dogma, but I think it's a little more intricate. You can take any boss down by doing enough damage to them, but the true reward is from harvesting their magical strand to enhance your magical power. To do this, you need to figure out how to make the boss vulnerable to harvest. The first boss is simple, and it gets more complex as you go. Every boss will give you a new power, and subsequent harvests will enhance your ability. If you kill the boss without harvesting, you will get more upgrade materials, so there's still a reason to farm bosses after you upgrade your abilities. On top of that, there are a handful of weapons that you craft, and they come with magic abilities of their own. You can always have a sword and shield, a two-hander, and a bow equipped. Then you can mix and match these for different uses before heading out into an expedition. While I enjoy the weapons, I actually think this is one of the weaker points of the game. The lock-on camera feels awkward, and I can't quite figure out why, and it's not going to rival the combat of a true action RPG like Elden Ring. After a certain point, I found myself just using the same gear that I felt was best in slot and had the most utility. Same goes for the armor sets. I'd love the system to be a little more malleable or in-depth. Regardless, some of the weapon abilities are really fun and make the boss fights more enjoyable because they give you better traversal. Like the kinetic two-hander allowing you to do a powerful uppercut that can also be used to scale buildings or bosses. Or the kinetic bow allowing me to blast myself into the air, even chaining them across long distances. If you followed me for a while, you might know how much I loved all the little mechanics from Breath of the Wild's physics engine, like the wind bomb. There's something special about discovering a new mechanic or technique that might or might not be intended by the developer. There's so many little interactions between your abilities, the environment, and enemies that create these special moments of discovery that are really difficult for most games to create organically. It's a big part of the reason why I think Breath of the Wild is special, and this game is too. I don't want to spoil too much, but I may make a future video of all the neat details I've discovered so far. The more you experiment with your abilities, the more you will discover how you can use them more effectively. I think it's a really rewarding system to play. Initially, I was a little disappointed to not get a glider or a grappling hook or something to help with traversal and exploration. But I slowly realized that the devs want you to figure out creative ways to get around using your abilities. Not every strand is intended for traversal, but the ones that are really fun to use. I can gush about how much I love the mechanics for a while, but what things are not so good? First and foremost, probably my biggest con is enemy variety. There's just not that many enemies in the game, and after a certain point you kind of ignore the basic enemies because you fought them hundreds of times and they're not a huge threat. This might be intended, but I just wish there were more. You do get materials from every enemy which are used to improve your weapons and armor, so they aren't entirely pointless. Variety is also scarce on equipment and magical abilities. I won't spoil how many you get exactly, but I just wish there were at least double the tools you could play with. This is part of why I hope this game gets a ton of success, so that they can develop more toys and more bosses for the game. The game is semi-open world, where you go out on expeditions to various large areas filled with enemies and one large boss. These areas will reset and change slightly every time you come back to camp, randomizing the available boss fight and also changing the weather. This makes subsequent visits feel fresh. However, it does get a tad bit repetitive, and I didn't feel like exploration was a huge focus of the game after a certain point. I would love if there were more weapons or some other rewards to find out in the world to encourage looking in all the nooks and crannies. What about the story and characters? I was actually worried early on that most of the characters would be incredibly generic and boring, but I do think they have a fun cast here brought to life by some pretty good voice acting on top of it. And thank God they have voice acting because there is a lot more dialogue than I anticipated. And since there's very few cutscenes, you're stuck clicking through it to progress quests. Luckily, each of the characters have their own unique personality, and I can see many people finding characters to relate to. There are a handful of these animated cutscenes that at least give some of the characters a little more life. On the topic of quests, there's very little fluff and bloat here, which I think is great, but the side quests are almost entirely there for world building and getting to know the small cast of characters. There are no levels for your progression, so you don't get experience for completing them, and you also don't get gear directly, but the quests will put you in areas of the game where you can find new gear in the world. I wouldn't skip over the quest because they enhance the exploration, and some do have some game-altering effects. They have created a metric ton of lore that you can read as well and learn more about the world they've created. It's a little much for me, but I have to appreciate the effort they went in to create something that feels rich with history, and it sets a stage for future stories to tell. In terms of difficulty, there are difficulty settings that allow you to adjust how much health you have and how much you heal with health potions. I played on normal mode and still found myself on the wrong end of a giant hammer more than I'd care to admit. Dying causes you to lose resources, so you need to be careful, but it's not overly difficult where I felt it was unfair in any way. It felt difficult in the right ways and also easy in the right ways, if that makes sense. Sometimes you need to run away to find more health potions, but boss health doesn't regenerate when you run. Fall damage is almost a non-issue, even from really high up. But don't go jumping into any bottomless pits. I find the world to be very pretty once you get into it. For lack of a better word, the trailers made me think the game's art style would be a little generic, but it really grew on me over time. Also, the ambient music and sounds are beautiful. A lot of the music just fits thematically, and some of it, like the Basecamp soundtrack, can be really relaxing. As for performance on PC, the game runs pretty well. I was able to play in 4K at 60 FPS with a 3080 Ti for most of the game, but I did get a handful of crashes. Unreal Engine 5 is beautiful, but it never seems to be very stable. I can't comment on console performance, but hopefully there are less crashes over there. I love my time with this game. I don't currently get early access to a lot of titles, so I was also just excited for this opportunity to discover this stuff on my own and form my own opinion. I expected this game to fall flat around the 8-hour mark, and I'm so glad that I was wrong. I had a blast, and it made me hungry for more. If any of this sounds appealing, I would encourage you to at least try the demo. This game could surprise you. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and follow the channel, and don't be too hard on yourself. You're doing great.